Welcome to Elephant in the Room, a podcast featuring real conversations with real therapists on the elephant in every room, trauma. With this show, we are aiming to share insights from professional practitioners on trauma, its impacts, as well as various modalities and resources on healing for survivors. This podcast is produced by the Breaking Free Foundation, a Canadian registered charity that supports trauma survivors in reclaiming their lives and finding healing. All of the therapists interviewed on this podcast are members of the Breaking Free Foundation Trauma Practitioner Network. My name is Amber Craig. I am a trauma survivor, one of the co-founders of the Breaking Free Foundation, and the proud host of this podcast. Today, I am pleased to welcome to the podcast Molly Harper, who, spoiler alert, is one of my best friends. Molly is a registered psychologist at Larchwood Counseling in Calgary. She has over 10 years of experience working in trauma and specializes in external behavior presentations in adolescents and school-based support approaches. Please welcome to the podcast, Molly.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this. Okay, so that was a very brief introduction. I know you have done way more things, so can you just tell the listeners a bit more about yourself and your professional background?
Yeah, for sure. So you are correct. I have been working in this field for about 10 years. I am a registered psychologist. My background is in counseling psychology. I have extra training in cognitive and behavioral approaches, but I pull from different techniques from all kinds of different theories. Narrative is definitely my favorite, and I find it just allows us to work through this trauma perspective really well. So as you mentioned, I do have a private practice element to my portfolio, but the bulk of my career continues to be working in schools. So the client group that I typically work with are students, families, and their teachers with regards to really big behaviors in school settings. And so as a part of that larger portion of my job and my career, it's hugely consultative. So I spend a lot of time supporting teachers in developing good strength-based programs to support student skills, to help them move through their lives a little bit smoother. Usually students who are displaying big behaviors are having big reactions on the inside as well. Yeah, so a little bit about what that is, because usually when I explain that to people, they're like, oh, I don't understand what you're talking about. Like, I know that psychologists work in schools. I know what a guidance counselor is, but I don't really understand what you're talking about. So it is kind of unique. A huge part of my job, actually, I would say the entire thing, is centered on getting a really good guess of what a young person's beliefs are about themselves. Okay, so once we've got kind of a good sense about how they feel about themselves and what they believe to be true about themselves or other people or the world, we can adjust their programming. So adjust the things that they do at school to encourage perhaps a more adaptive view of themselves. So a more positive view of or belief about who they are. The aim is to try to get them to develop some sort of a belief that doesn't hold them back. Right. Okay, so we do this kind of estimating by taking a trauma-informed look at the students' experiences with themselves, with other people, with their environment or their world. So what we're looking at is what's going on, what's happening, what does this mean for this student, what does it mean for their family? And so I think that's probably why you've brought me here, so that we can kind of talk a little bit about how to use a trauma-informed lens to I guess, understand people's experiences. That is the biggest part of my job.
Yes, it is exactly why I asked you to do this, because our organization has had a major influx of parents reaching out on behalf of their children and children reaching out directly to us, which is not something that we saw for kind of like the first 5 years that we existed. So we get a lot of questions about it. So I really want to base this conversation around trauma and youth specifically. So just to start with a really overarching question, how do traumatic experiences manifest differently in children versus adults, or do they at all?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So we know that a developing brain, so the brain of a child that is in its process of change, is way more vulnerable to the effects of adverse experiences in life. That's because their brains are more plastic. That makes them also more fragile and a little bit more vulnerable to different things. Of course, there's an element of resiliency there, but we also know um, there's a huge lasting impact when we're talking about adverse experiences on children. Okay, so this fragile state that they're in, this like constant state of growth, does make them more vulnerable to some of the pervasive impacts of trauma. So when I say pervasive impacts of trauma, I'm thinking things like illness. We know it's connected to ongoing physical illnesses. It makes them more susceptible to becoming really sick. We also know it impacts learning challenges, social difficulties, issues with regulation, overall just ability to cope with the world. Of course, that leads quite naturally to mental health conditions, which we know tend to persist without support. And so obviously, adverse childhood experiences profoundly impact development and function. We see this especially evident in schools because that's kind of what school is all about, right? It's about developing and learning how to do different things. It's about learning how to function, right? So, okay, so back to your question. So I guess to use your words, what are some of the ways that trauma manifests in children? So in schools, you can see these things quite obviously. So I'm just going to list them. I have a list that I have often gone over with staff and teachers, just kind of talking about, let's get a really good understanding of what this kind of thing looks like. Generally speaking, of course, because everybody's different. And I think it's important to note that. But okay, right. So ways that trauma shows up: kids being withdrawn, depressed, anxious. They struggle with self-esteem and relationships. We often see impulsivity. So having a hard time controlling your behaviors. We see lots of non-compliance, so not following the rules, being really defiant. We see aggression, hyperactivity, irritability, disruptiveness, disrespectful. Some people wouldn't label that, so just kind of a bit of an attitude. Challenges with attention and focus. So I'm only like partway through this list. So any of those things really impact an ability, I would say the ability for a child to just even sit in a chair at school. So all of those things would make that really difficult. I could argue, I think any of us could argue, it would be hard to walk inside of a school. So not even getting to the classroom and the desk, we're talking about just being able to tolerate the different environment shifts. Okay, so other things we see in kids: sleep, so sleep disruptions, different somatic responses. So lots of reports of stomach aches, or I'm just like not feeling really well. And sometimes they go unexplained and they go to doctors and doctors clear them. There's nothing wrong with you. We sent you for blood tests. There's nothing there. We also see challenges with just understanding outcomes of choices. So that's mostly evident when there's problem solving challenges, or you see kids making weird decisions that you're like, hey, but I just told you, like, if you do this, this happens, and it doesn't seem to quite click. So related to that, anything that's forward thinking, organization, setting goals for themselves, having a good understanding of even like what is next for them. Reading, memory, critical thinking, using language, anything with executive functioning. We talked a little bit about decreased coping. I'm going to continue because I think it's important, but there's so many. Distress tolerance, emotional regulation, challenges with interpersonal relationships, managing interactions or starting an interaction, social problem solving. So, I mean, we all know that kids are developing social skills, so a lot of interactions are kind of awkward anyways. And then you've got somebody coming in who's lacking that basic foundation because they were too distressed to learn it initially. And we also see self-harm. Okay, so that is just a massive list of how trauma does present itself in children. And I mean, thinking about that, I'm not sure that trauma manifests itself much differently in adults. I think we see trauma impacting progression and performance in adults, socially, emotionally, behavioral. We see that in grown-ups as well. I don't know that adults technically get less stuck by traumatic experiences than kids. I think we do see it a little differently, and I think there's some age-related or developmentally related considerations to have in our understanding, right? But yeah, I'm not super convinced. I think it's really dangerous for kids because of their vulnerabilities, but I don't know, I don't know that adults have it any easier, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I know it's a very exhaustive list, but I appreciate you going through it because my hope is that if parents are listening to this or caregivers or teachers or whoever, they might have some light bulb moments of trying
For
to think of
sure.
that child in their life that maybe they need to look into something deeper. So I do think it's important that we go through the whole list of
Yeah,
different ways
totally.
it can
And I mean,
impact.
some of those symptoms are related to all kinds of other disorders as well,
Right.
right? Or experiences or conditions. It doesn't have to be just trauma, and they're not even investigative symptoms. I often will say to people, it's not your job to kind of like dig into that necessarily. It's your job to
Right.
wear some sensitivity. And so if you are looking at a presentation of a child and you're thinking like, what is going on with you? Like, what is that? I worked with this wonderful principal for a number of years, and his kind of catchphrase was, don't get furious, get curious. So what are we like, what are we looking at here? Is there a
Yeah.
possibility for this to be this presentation that I'm seeing? Is it possible that that's not the child's fault? Is it possible that this behavior is being caused by something else? And so kind of thinking backwards, and I'll talk a little bit about that too, because I think, of course, my work's been centered on understanding behavior. And I think it's important, but yeah,
I love that phrase actually. I'm writing it down.
I know it's so
It's a good
great.
one.
I didn't ask his permission.
That's okay. We didn't name him.
Sorry. Yeah, it was actually quite brilliant, and he's done quite a bit of work in understanding trauma in schools. So he might be another cool resource for us to look into.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so another trend that we've seen in particular in the last few years is, like I mentioned, we're seeing more kids and parents reaching out for kids, but we're seeing a lot more people reaching out, looking for support for an entire household where
Yeah.
all of the children in one particular house has been impacted by something traumatic and they're all
Mhm.
really struggling to cope with that. So I am just curious in cases where that would be something where a household is seeking support, what could support look like? Meaning, would it be more common for each individual child to be seeing a therapist, or is there a situation where family dynamic would benefit
Mhm.
from doing some kind of therapeutic experience together?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so short answer, yes, totally. There are a number of agencies and professionals locally who do a ton of family work. I'm kind of the, so I should have given a disclaimer. I totally support family systems work. I think we all exist within a network and a system of different interactions. And families are incredibly complex systems. When something happens to one person in that sort of net or that system, the entire system is impacted. So in some way, right? So we don't go unimpacted because we are always connected to other people. Um, and so I think it's important, of course, to consider that interconnectedness of families to support healing. There's a number of places that you can go and do this. What people need to look for is somebody who's got family systems work or like a family systems background. I think it's probably pretty standard that most people out there working with children have that as a bit of a foundation to their theoretical approach to things. I think personally, it's very special as a therapist to have an entire family want to come in and seek support together, or
Mm-hmm.
they want to come in to support the member of their family that has experienced something. Um, yeah, going back to my kind of thought about being stuck as an adult or a child in their experiences of trauma. Yeah, you're stuck with other people too, right? And so I
Mm-hmm.
think there's an opportunity to better understand what the impact is, which then allows you to kind of individualize your approach and support people, but it's also allowing for a greater support network, right? So you have time with a client for like an hour in a room, right? And when they leave, you're letting them off into this other place. And I think there's a big responsibility for grown-ups in the world, but in family systems to kind of look after some of that stuff. So I think it is important that you get some people involved when you can. Um, no, I think that's great. It is very special. It gives a therapist a really clear picture, which lets them do a really good job of making suggestions or allowing for the reflections to be really meaningful and fit within, a person's existing understanding of the world. Yeah, I think that's great. I think it's great that you guys are seeing an influx in that. I'm wondering if that's, trauma's kind of become a bit of a buzzword and people are starting to talk about it, and I think that's really great. But yeah, I'm pleased to hear you're hearing from people wanting to get some greater help.
Yes, I wish we could help them quicker, but it is still good that they are reaching out for help for sure.
Yeah, and seeking
Um,
support together. I think that's awesome.
exactly, yes. So shifting gears a little bit, if
Hmm.
if there's a situation where one individual child in a home has been through a significant trauma, and it's very clear to the adults in the home that that child could benefit from some therapeutic support. However, the child is resistant to that
Hmm.
idea. What would you suggest to parents how they would tackle a situation like that?
Yes. Okay. So, resistance in the therapeutic process or hesitation, reluctance, anything like that is really common for adults and kids when they're engaging in a therapeutic process. It's not easy reflecting, it's not easy receiving feedback, it's not easy making change. Okay. So, um, it's normal to have some resistance. But when we're talking straight refusal, it is a little bit different. We can't force kids or anybody for that matter to engage in therapy. It's unethical, but it's also just not effective. And I
Mhm.
have, through my years, have had lots of conversations with parents. They're like, "Yeah, but I just really want them to come in," and I'm like, "Yeah, I know you do, but it's not going to work." One thing we know about um, people in general is that as soon as we are forced to do something, we become extremely stubborn. And then we
Right.
can no longer help that person, and that doesn't help anybody. So I think it can be really helpful to support parents with their own understanding and processes of the traumatic event or of trauma in general, so that they can be better equipped in the meantime to be emotionally present for their kids. That will allow them to be okay. So that'll allow them to kind of catch the moments for seeking help. Something that I am always reminding people of is your presence is totally an intervention. So we need to look after you so that you can be present for your kid, to support them when they need it, but also to kind of catch those windows. Now might be a good time for us to talk about how, hey, this discomfort that you're feeling, I might have a solution for that. So you don't need to sit in this discomfort all the time. But if you are not present enough to notice that, you might miss those opportunities. So the short answer is, you can't force kids. If you really want your kid to go, then maybe you should go. And then you get to be a
Yes.
tool in your home by extension, which of course is not always a popular answer, but I do think it's actually one of the most effective strategies. It just allows you to be a bit more informed and in tune. Um, if you're seeing a therapist that you hope your child will see, it also allows you to kind of do some of that bridging. So kids should be a little bit nervous about talking to other adults, right? Like that's normal. Again, back to this resistance thing, that's totally normal. um, but it allows you to bridge that. So you can say, hey, I want you to see somebody, but also I've already approved of them. And it's not just my approval, I've actually experienced it. Like, she's okay.
Right.
I can prove that to you. So yeah, that's my answer. If your kid doesn't want to go, you should probably go.
That's a great answer, actually, and I would like to recycle that in my own life. So
Yeah. Oh,
I
you
think
know
that's
what I
great.
should mention? Okay, I should mention. So you've asked me a question about children seeking help. Okay, and we're talking about playing the long game in supporting kids, but I do probably and definitely should mention that if we're talking about a child at risk, so there is a serious situation happening right here, so they're reporting suicidal ideation or they're engaging in, self-harm or some sort of other mental health crisis, adults really should take some quicker steps to help young people. So I'm going to make my plug for safety. Anybody who works with me knows all about this plug, so I'm just going to do it anyways. I think it's good reminders.
Mhm.
So anybody can call the distress center or the mental health helpline for guidance if they are querying what they're looking at or they have big concerns about supporting somebody in the moment. There's also lots of other cool places that are youth centered nowadays. So there's Eastside Community Mental Health Services through Woods Homes. There's also the Summit Youth Mental Health Center, which is like a youth mental health hospital unit that is close to the foothills, and it's pretty cool. It's very new. There was a massive government grant for that. We've had lots of kids kind of go through there. South Health Campus Mental Health Unit also has like a youth urgent care center. All other hospitals can see people that are having a hard time. You can, of course, always call 911 in an emergency as well.
Right. I do appreciate you making that caveat because these questions I'm asking are really specific around something where it's not an emergency, but yes, there could
Yeah,
be an instance where there is one and people should know what to do in that situation.
totally. And I mean it's a little tricky, right? Like it's our job working in mental health to try to slow things down for people. But we're slowing things down knowing that we have the awareness and knowledge of when we have to act quicker, right?
Right.
So yeah, just saying, I suggested parents play the long game, do their own work, but also don't
Right.
miss out on treating a crisis.
Absolutely. Um, okay. So talk like this is a really good thread to my next question, which is around um, parents who have never explored the option of therapy for their child. I know every therapist has a different approach, but just speaking from your own practice with kids, how do you create safety with children in order to do the work that you do?
Okay, so I'm going to give you some answers that are what other psychologists and therapists and social workers will probably give. But before I do that, we know that therapy works best when you have just kind of a connection with the other person. And I mean that as a client, right? So we know that you will get the most from a therapeutic relationship if you like the person on the other side. So there's lots we can do. But we know it just works best if there's kind of a click. So I always encourage people to shop around if they can. There's lots of free services where you are able to call ahead and see if you can get in some free introductory stuff. You do have to kind of like the person. Okay, so outside of that, so everybody needs to know what to expect from new situations. That's especially true for children, but I do think it is relevant for everybody. And so it is important that therapists kind of map out what they can about the experience of therapy. So not only so that people can decide whether that's something they want to do, so we call this informed consent, um, but also because it allows for a sense of safety to be established. So you're basically presenting yourself as somebody who's thought of everything, who's going to tell you about the things that they can, and is basically saying all these things that could happen. I'm still going to be here for that, right? So that's a huge part of it. Okay, so that's just ethical practice. We do that in our worlds all the time. This process of sharing information about therapy is obviously best done in a way that the person can understand. Um, so when we're working with children, things like word choice, pace, reminders about the control that they get to have in this situation are especially important. This obviously encourages nice, meaningful engagement. It aligns, of course, with our ethics, but it's also really symbolic for kids whose safety's been taken from them, right? So we're giving them a chance to have some control over this process and to be able to predict what's going to happen when they're sitting with this other person talking about the things that um, are bothering them or that they think are bothering them or might be holding them back. Okay, you asked about trust as well. So in terms of trust, it's important to come up with some sort of an agreement at the beginning about what kind of information is going to be shared with grown-ups that are involved in the situation. So those supportive parents or guardians or whoever's kind of involved, and what types of situations are likely to result in extra help being required. So in the therapy world, we call this going over limits to confidentiality. It's important for kids to know that we have some boundaries set there and that their best interests are going to be looked after. In general, though, I mean, therapists create safety in their process of just being consistently non-judgmental, consistently accepting and understanding. We basically give information about what to expect, and then we walk the talk to prove that we mean it, right? Um, yeah, so that is a bit of a general answer. Obviously, there's lots of personality components there too, right? If it clicks for people, it clicks for people.
For sure. Um, so we all have kids in our lives, whether we have kids or not. So
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a parent or an adult and they're around a child who has been traumatized, how can we create safety for that child, outside of a therapeutic setting, just in general
Yeah.
everyday life? What can adults do to create safety for traumatized children, and why is that so important?
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to answer that backwards. So why is it important to consider safety? So I'm of the belief that without safety, we can't really do anything else. Years ago, I did a workshop with somebody else, for teachers actually, and we tried to describe this for people. So why is it so important that you feel safe? And one of the activities we were standing on one of those like wobble boards,
Mhm.
blindfolded, and then trying to catch balls. And so it's impossible, and it feels
Right,
really terrifying because you have things coming at you, and you're not really certain of the floor even, and you're not really sure like what people are saying about you because you also can't really filter in the information, and it's impossibly hard. And then in that process, we were then asking each other questions and asking to display some of our skills, right?
right,
It's impossible. Without safety, we have nothing. If you don't feel
right,
safe, then you can't access the things you know, and you also can't access the ability to learn something different. And when
right.
we're talking about, I mean, this is a bit philosophical too, but when we're talking about children, I mean, their entire process is learning. That is what being a child is. They're always in a state of growing, and it's kind of our job as grown-ups to do something to support that, right? And that's kind of a bit globally. But when we're talking about kids who have had something happen and they're looking for healing, or society wants them to heal or something like that, it's imperative that they have safety. We're asking them to heal,
Right.
that's asking them to learn something different, right? They've had
Mhm.
something happen that's forced them to reconsider themselves and the entire world in a different way. We're now asking them to unlearn that and to learn something different. So that's a skill. So we have to go back to figuring out how to help them feel comfortable, with themselves and with other people, and just even existing. Um, yeah, so I think it's on us as grown-ups to work on that safety piece. Um, that's important. That is on us. The teaching
Mhm.
of skills part might also be on us. So helping them through this process might also be on us. But I kind of feel like if you set up the environment right, and maybe this is just my educational background, if you set up a learning environment, the learning happens,
Right.
right? So if we set up safety, safety happens. If we set up safety, safety happens, and it allows learning to begin. Um, yeah, so it's basically the opposite of being stuck. So if we set up something
Right.
for children to feel safe, they will explore and they will grow, and that's the opposite of being stuck. So, okay, answering you backwards. So some ways that I think we can create safety for kids is to first become knowledgeable about trauma and its effects. We have to be curious about the meaning of behaviors. So, understanding that what we're seeing is always a clue to what kinds of needs are being left unmet. And I don't mean, I mean, I could mean basic needs, but I'm also just meaning some of those more individualized needs. So, we need to know what those are so that we can kind of tailor our approach to kids. Um, yeah, behaviors are always clues to what kids need, and what they need to
Mhm.
feel safe always. So yes, be knowledgeable about what we're dealing with here. Be knowledgeable about what it looks like, and be curious about that. Um, Secondly, I think it's important to be regulated ourselves.
Mhm.
Uh, all kids look to grown-ups to kind of model how to manage. And if we are not managing, or we're not managing well, we can come across as really unpredictable and unreliable. which even though you might be what you would consider to be a safe grown-up, you may not look that way or feel that way. So we're talking about that perceived sense of safety. Of course, we're not expected to be perfect. I mean, I'm a parent myself. I have had all kinds of moments where I have not been regulated, and I'm working on it. And I think we are always in that sort of process. But I do really think we owe it to kids to be safe. And if we're able to present ourselves as accepting and that we can manage whatever's coming at us, that allows us to be seen as a resource for kids. And that kind of is what we are and what we should be probably in our little society here, right? Yeah, okay. So other things that I think we can pull from understanding safety in schools, especially. So one thing that we talk about a lot in schools in my work when we're trying to create a sense of safety with kids is looking for ways to just increase predictability and consistency in routines and in our interactions. So I just talked a little bit about how you can think about the way you interact with kids. Like, are you being consistent? Are you being reliable? Are you being predictable for them? Do they know what they're getting from you from day to day? Do they know how you're able to kind of manage things? But I don't mean this in rigidity or compliance and routines. That's not at all what I mean. But it's more about creating different systems so that kids know what to expect from the space and from the people that are in it. And that lends nicely to families, right? But that's not an easy thing to do. I'm giving people, when I say this, I'm just giving you a lens to look at. The how to is super individualized. Like, just get somebody to help you with that. Go talk to somebody through it, and looking for ways you can kind of create some groundedness in your household and in your little family units.
Those are good tools, I think, that give people a really good sense of what they can do. I'm curious if there's anything additional to be aware of if the child has been through sexual trauma. Are there additional precautions that we need to be aware of when we're trying to create safety, or is it just, it doesn't matter if it's sexual trauma or not?
Okay, so tough question. Similar answer to before. We have to be knowledgeable. We have to be knowledgeable on what this could look like, so that we can better place ourselves in understanding what that person is experiencing within their body. So I think sometimes there are different presentations or symptoms associated with sexual trauma that we should be knowledgeable about and consider. But sexual trauma, much like other types of physical related abuse situations, really changes the sense of safety that we have with our own bodies. And that is something that we literally walk around with every single day, right? And that journey to just being kind of okay, or the journey to okayness, can be really long and difficult for people. I think it's important, of course, to be educated on some of the more unique symptoms of sexual trauma, so that we can better understand, provide acceptance when you see the signs of your child trying to regain control of their own bodies, right? So their sense of safety has been removed. So we do see kids kind of displaying some behaviors as they're trying to regain control, and their system itself, its whole system, is trying to figure out what's happened. So yeah, there are some unique things. There are phenomenal organizations in Calgary that cater specifically, which of course you know about and have probably talked lots about too. There are some uniquenesses for sure. Yeah.
Okay, just kind of like backing up to a broader lens on this topic. You've touched on it in a few different ways, but just to kind of like cap it nicely, what do you think it means to be trauma informed in your own definition?
Yes. So it's kind of a tough question, because initially, so years ago, I was asked by somebody, hey, can you just run like a quick afternoon workshop on being trauma informed or trauma sensitive? And I was like, what do you mean? And I think for a lot of people that are, working in the field, initially it's like, well, that's just normal practice. You should just always be that way. But since that, and I mean, that was years ago, but since that immediate reaction, I've had quite a bit of reflection, and it's something that you actually have to maintain. So I'm going to give you my kind of definition. It's got bits and pieces pulled from everywhere. I mean, Government of Canada has like a trauma informed definition, and so this is kind of the way I would perhaps try to explain it to people. It's of course about maintaining trauma awareness, what it is, what it looks like, how you feel about it, what your biases are about it. And most of the people I work with have a lot of really positive biases against or for people who have experienced trauma. And although that's really great, that still offers a bit of a filtered lens. So I think regular reflective practice is important, and that's a part of being trauma informed. But anyways, okay, so knowing what it is, what it could look like, what it might feel like, anything you might need to know to ensure that the space that you create for others, so whether that's like a literal space like a school or a classroom or an office or whatever, or a figurative space, so the relational space that you're creating between you and somebody else, is safe, invitational, respectful, understanding, accepting of other people and the experiences that they might have had. For me, this means trust, fairness, transparency, especially in practices and the way that we kind of go about things. We need to engage in like active steps against re-traumatizing people. I think in our earlier stages of societal understanding of the impacts of trauma, we developed this belief that in order for you to be trauma sensitive or care about trauma, the way you care about trauma is to encourage people to talk about it. And that is like a very dangerous process because that's a very unsafe experience for people to have, right? So we have to take steps against re-traumatization, whether that's direct, hey, I accept you, I accept that you've been abused. That is quite a cornering type of practice, and we've gotten away from that. I mean, I think that was the early pendulum swing. I'm pleased to see people being a bit more, aware and sensitive and present as opposed to aggressive. But yeah, back to what I'm saying about this. It's about having this pervasive belief that there's a capacity for growth in people. And I think that's probably the most important part about being trauma informed. So you have to be informed, and then you have to hold this belief that people can still grow, and that there is a life after trauma. Again, of course, if we set up safety, it'll happen.
I've never heard a definition like that, and I like that one the most, to be honest, because it gives room for hope, and that often gets
Yeah,
left out of the equation.
yeah, and I think if you talk to psychologists and therapists and people that work in these supportive roles, I mean, our whole job, our entire job, is about finding ways for hope to kind of come in, right? And we
Right.
can't just be like, you have hope, here it is, right? We have to look for ways for it to kind of shine through in different places, and trauma especially. I'll just follow that same kind of metaphor, but the trauma can be especially dark, right?
Hmm.
I think anybody who's been through something like that might agree with that sort of experience, and it is really hard to let the light in, and it's really hard. It might be really scary too to actually do that. Some people find a bit of comfort in that darkness because at least it's protective, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we do need to be informed. We need to be informed, and we need to know that there's growth. So not necessarily
Hmm.
change and healing. I mean, that's not always the goal. It's just, is there room for you to grow and develop a bit?
Hmm. This might be a dumb question given everything we've just talked about, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Why is it so important for schools to be trauma informed?
Yeah, so I'll give you my like barking answer. We we have to care about this because if kids don't feel safe, they don't learn anything. And that is what we're doing in schools, right? We're trying to
Right.
set up some learning. Anyways, so the other reason why I think we should care about it, so it's important because kids have to feel safe to learn, but it's also important because trauma informed practices benefit everybody. They don't just
Right.
benefit kids that are struggling with their own sense of self, right? They're they benefit everybody. There's nothing that I just mentioned in my definition that does not benefit somebody who is supporting a traumatized kid or an agency that is looking to just kind of have people within it. We all benefit from fairness. We all benefit from transparency. We all benefit from safety. So
Yeah,
it's important to do it, and it's also important for everybody.
yeah, fair enough. So not every school has a Molly. So what improvements could teachers or schools make to be more trauma informed? And maybe I'm speaking more about teachers on an individual basis. If a teacher's listening to this and they work in a
Sure.
school, what could they do as themselves to become more trauma informed?
For sure. I think just taking steps to ensure that you're kind of maintaining that competency. So I kind of alluded to that before. Um, it's much like our kind of obligation to be culturally competent, to understand kind of what other people are coming to us with, and understanding our own sort of culture. Trauma informed practices are the same. It's We need to understand it. We need to understand that behaviors are clues. We need to ensure that staff are managing themselves. Again, a child's best tool in this process is just a good, safe grown up. And so you can totally be that. And for a lot of teachers, if not all of them, they're totally capable of that. And they probably are that already. Um, yeah. So what can teachers do? Engage in reflective practice. There's a ton of really teacher specific checklists that exist, and I can send you. I found an article years ago that has a whole bunch of them as appendices, and they're great. This just helps us maintain that competency, right? So take a look at those once a year, once a semester, and you're like, okay, am I still doing all these things? It's very easy to slip into practices and cut corners. That's not necessarily a reflection of you not being a good teacher or not being trauma informed. It just means that this is a thing that needs to be maintained. We have to just stay up on it. It's just a practice. Yeah, it's good conduct to do too. It's probably good parenting conduct too to engage in that reflective practice. Although I have to state it's been way harder for me to engage in reflective parenting practice than it has for me in like good professional conduct practice. But yeah, so staying on top of this is just a competency, something that you have to practice on a regular basis and do some check-ins and say to yourself, like, okay, do I get this? Is this weird thing that I'm annoyed by in this kid? Is it possible that this has to do with something that they might have experienced in an adverse kind of way? Yeah, it's just easy to forget that sometimes.
Yeah. Do you have any favorite resources for kids on the
Mhm.
topic of trauma that can help them learn or cope?
Yes. So resources for kids really depend on what their needs are, and where they might be at kind of in their process. But there are a number of really good children's books out there that offer some good validation and understanding for even really specific trauma events. My favorite resource for therapeutic books is actually this account on Instagram called the Kid Lit Mama. And of course, we can try to find a way to link that. She posts collections of really good books based on different themes. And somebody that I work with, a social worker that I work with, found that, and we save these books all the time. So we're like, okay, that's such a good one. I should have that. That's such a specific experience, and many of the books are just beautiful. So that's
Mm,
probably my favorite one. But otherwise, the best trauma support for a kid is just safe grown-ups.
yes, I wrote down that Instagram account, so I'm going to check that out.
Yeah, she's awesome. She posts stuff all the time. It's great.
That is fantastic. Any favorite resources for teachers or parents on similar topics?
Yeah, so there's the classic big names that I think are really valuable and have a lot of some really easy to digest materials. So anything by Bruce Perry, Ricky Greenwald is like he wrote the Childhood Trauma Handbook, which is a phenomenal resource for people working with kids. Gordon Neufeld also has some pretty decent parenting related direction stuff. And of course, Gabor Mate is also kind of a front runner on understanding the different effects of trauma. Any of those things really guide supportive work with kids. There's also this really good Australian resource for teachers that I return to every year. Um, it in my work with teachers, especially, it is so good. It's on Google. It's free. It's awesome, and I will share it. It is. I can't remember how many pages it is. It's pretty decently big actually, but the wording and the phrasing is just perfect. And it's easy to digest. There's lots of different chapters. Yeah, it's awesome. So we can send that out too for teachers. I return to it every year. It is so good. Never stops
That is
being
great.
good.
Amazing. Anything else you'd like to share before we close?
I don't think so. I think I have yet again talked your ear off.
Never.
It's
I
my
just
usual,
appreciate
it's my usual practice, right? I never
I
get a chance to
appreciate
talk.
well, we have conversations like this all the time because I know you, and it's nice to just actually like record one of them because we always find ourselves in interesting
Totally.
conversations about this. So I do really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Um,
Of
and
course.
we will link in the show notes some of the resources that were mentioned today. So thank you again for being on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. This was such a pleasure.
The Breaking Free Foundation offers therapy grants for trauma survivors in Alberta, and we also host 2 free support meetings a month. One is in person in Calgary, and one is online. For more information on trauma therapy and our organization, please visit us online at breakingfreefoundation.ca. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share. That's all for now. Stay well.